Hey guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to make this hybrid Slingbow slingshot, which is on one side a slingbow and on the other side a slingshot. If you're not a slingshot expert, then you probably won't know what that means, and basically it is so that on one side it's a slingshot and you can just fire normal bow bearings or rocks or whatever, but then on the other side it's a slingbow, and that's a bow powered by rubber firing arrows. I decided to make this after a video that theartofweapons uploaded with his design of a Rambone Slingshot converted into a slingbow. He demonstrated that there are a lot of problems with using just a normal slingshot and then trying to convert it into a slingbow, considering that you need different bands, whisker biscuit arrow rest, and a lot of other different factors as well. So today's going to be the tutorial video, and I'm going to be explaining every step of the process on how to make this slingbow. It was quite a hard woodworking project, and I wouldn't recommend making it unless you have some basic knowledge of woodworking, since you also need a few woodworking tools and materials. This slingbow has a lot of different parts laminated onto it, and they are just for looks. The only part for strength is the 18mm multiplex core, which is essential if you're going to make this design. If you did just want to make a functional slingbow that doesn't look very good, then you could make it entirely just out of plywood, and it would be probably one of the strongest slingbows that you could make. So now let's see how to make it. The first step is going to the link in the description down below to my blueprints of this slingbow. I designed this on one side using the Rambone Slingshot design from theartofweapons, and then on the other side the slingbow design that theartofweapons converted from a Rambone Slingshot. You need to then print out this to the right size so that it fits your hand, and if it's too small, just enlarge it using a photo editing program. You then need to cut it out and draw it onto some 18mm plywood. I'm using a scroll saw to cut it out, since it can cut out all of the corners really well and I can do completely accurately to the line. It can also do interior cuts by taking out the blade and putting it in the middle, so that I can cut out that circle in the middle. You could also cut out the circle using a hole saw for a drill. This is what the 18mm multiplex core looks like once I've cut it out, and it has to be multiplex since no other woods would be strong enough for this design. As you can see, it's very accurate to the lines of what I originally drew onto the wood, so now it's time to go on to the next step. So now I'm going to laminate on this rare piece of wood, which is an Irish wych elm wood, and it's from the burl of the tree, so it's got a very cool grain. I bought most of the rare woods which I'm using on this slingshot off eBay, and I bought them as pen blanks, but they're also good for laminating onto slingshots. I just glue it on using wood glue, and then I clamp it up in my vise and leave the glue to set. In this photo you can see the large variety of woods which I'm going to laminate on next. I've tried to put contrasting woods next to each other because I think that looks really nice. So going from left to right, on the slingshot fork on the far left, I've got some mahogany wood which I've cut out to the basic shape. Either side of the wych elm wood I've got some pine wood, which is just going to make it wide enough to fit the slingshot, and then just above that I've got an oak spacer, which is just a very thin piece of oak, and then above that I've got some elm wood just in the middle of the slingbow part, and then either side of that I've got some acacia hardwood, which is going to look very nice once I've oiled it. Since there are so many pieces of wood here, I can't glue them all on in one go because I don't have enough clamps, so I'm going to all glue them on separately. Again, I'm just using wood glue, which leaves a very strong bond. Once the glue is set, I'm now using a wood rasp which I bought off eBay to file down all of the edges until they're flush with the wood. I'm basically just making this the same shape as the multiplex plywood, but I'm not going to contour any of it yet. Be careful that when you do this to not rasp too aggressively and pull pieces of wood off the slingshot fork, or to rasp too aggressively and splinter off the edges, leaving gaps. Now it's time to make the palm swell, which is probably the hardest part of the process, since I had to make sure that it was comfortable on both sides. To do this, I was using my half-round rasp which I bought off eBay to remove material and to shape the palm swell. I was comparing it to some of my other slingshots which I'd made, which had very comfortable palm swells, and I was making sure that it was comfortable on both sides. Make sure that you don't rush this step or you'll end up with a slingshot that isn't comfortable on either side. Once I had the palm swell shaped, I laminated on a thin piece of mahogany over the gap near the top of the slingbow. I then flattened it and rounded it along with all of the other pieces, and this is what the slingbow looks like so far. It's comfortable on both sides when I pull on it very hard. Now I'm just using a rasp again to shape the mahogany wood which I've got on the top of the slingshot fork. I'm just going to shape this so that it tapers and gets thinner towards the edges, so that 1, it looks better, and 2, that it's not so thick. As I curve it, I'm being careful to make sure that it's symmetrical on both sides to make it look nice, and also so that I don't go too aggressively and chip off bits of the wood. After that was done, I decided that it was time to laminate on some oak for the finger swell. This is what the slingshot looks like now, and I do admit that I added way too much glue onto the wood. I've now started rasping and shaping all of the oak wood into shape. I'm making it so that it's got a finger swell that's symmetrical on either side, so it's comfortable both ways up again. The finger swell is less important, and you can just have it flat, but you need to round it so that it doesn't dig into your fingers. Even though the oak is very tough wood and I'm filing across the grain, my rasp still made very short work of it. Now that that's done, I've laminated on two 18mm thick pieces of mahogany on either side of the oak. It's important that the fork on the slingbow side is at least 2.5cm thick so that when you fire the slingbow, the bands don't push all the way through the whisker biscuit. This is what the slingbow looks like now, and I've got parts laminated onto the forks and the glue has completely set so that I've rounded them down, and the slingshot looks and feels really nice so far, and it's really starting to take shape. Here I'm gluing on two pieces of hardwood on the other side of the forks for the slingshot, and that's just going to help fill in some more gaps. I'm now rasping and shaping the hardwood down to the basic side profile of the slingshot so that it looks nice. Again, you need to be careful to not chip off any bits of the wood, especially on the corners of the slingshot forks. This is what the slingshot looks like once that's done. I've also added grooves for the bands to attach on the slingshot side, and also on the slingbow side. As you can see, the slingshot's completely symmetrical on both sides, and that's going to help add to the looks. Now I'm going over the whole thing with a metal file to get out all of the deep scratches left behind by the rasp. It's important that you do this before moving on to sanding, since the sandpaper won't be able to remove all of the scratches. If you don't have any metal files, you could also use 80 grit sandpaper, wrap down a pen or a piece of wooden dowel. It's very important that you do this part properly and that you get out all of the scratches, since when you move on to the sandpaper it would take much longer. This is what the slingshot looks like now, and as you can see it's much smoother and there are no big jagged lines left behind by the rasp. It's now also at the final shape that I want it to be, and if I wanted to change anything I'd have to do that now before I move on to sanding. So since I'm about to move on to sanding, I'm going to oil the slingshot with a layer of sunflower oil. Linseed oil is much better, but my order of linseed oil is taking a very long time to arrive. The reason that it's better to oil the slingshot now is because then it soaks up a lot more of the oil and the grain is much more prominent afterwards. I like to apply the oil just using a piece of paper cloth. After that's done, the wood is noticeably darker and there's a nice contrast between the layers of the multiplex plywood. Now it's time to move on to sanding the slingshot all the way up to 600 grit. With my slingshots, when they're made entirely out of wood, I like to sand them only up to 600 grit, because if you sand them up to a complete polish and then buff them on a buffing wheel, it means that you can't really see the grain very well because it's so smooth. For the finest finish, I like to use sanding sponges because they leave a very smooth finish and they're good at sanding curves. I bought a pack of 60 sanding sponges off eBay with various grits. It's important that you spend lots of time on the lower grits of sandpaper, since that will remove the most scratches, and then once you've removed all of the scratches that you're going to with the sandpaper, you can move on to the next grit until you get all the way up to 600. So this is what the slingshot looks like once it's sanded up all the way to 600 grit, and it does look quite good, but some of the oil is quite light and patchy in places, so I'm going to give it another coat. Once I've given it another coat, it looks really nice and all of the grain is really prominent in all of the different types of wood, especially in the Irish witch elm wood, which is in the palm swell. Now it's time to make the whisker biscuit arrow rest, which is going to hold the arrow in place. If you don't want to make one, you could alternatively just buy one off the internet, but it's much more satisfying to make one yourself. To make it, I'm going to be using an old draft excluder from a door, and you can just buy this from most hardware stores. Some people also like to use toothbrush heads to make them. The good thing about this draft excluder is it has a bendy aluminium frame which I can bend round into a circle. Here I'm just bending it round into the same circle as what's on the back of the slingbow, and I'm just going to keep on bending it until it's the right size. Once that's done, it looks something like this. As you can see here, it fits quite nicely over the front of the slingbow, but there are a lot of bristles poking out and it looks quite ugly, so I'm just going to trim them down a little bit. Now I need to glue it on using some epoxy resin, and this is just a 2-part epoxy resin called araldite, which is really strong, and that should hold it in place. Once the glue is set, it looks something like this. As you can see, when I put an arrow inside it, it can slide around freely and there's basically no resistance, and when I pull it through, the fletchings barely make any resistance on the edge of the bristles. So now the Slingbow is finished and it's ready to take on some bands. The final thing to do is to make the bands and attach a pouch on one side to the end of the bands, and then make some shorter bands and then attach a piece of string on the other end. And this piece of string just needs to have 2 bowline knots tied in each end and then a D-loop tied behind that, and that's just for an archery release to attach to it. If you want to have decent power, there's no way that you couldn't use an archery release, because it would be almost impossible to pull it back just with your fingers. Once I've done all this, the Slingbow side fires pretty well like this. And the Slingshot side also fires very well. If you want to see more video of shooting it, I've got a full shooting video where I test this weapon to its limits, shooting against different targets, and there'll be a link in the description down below. So thanks for watching, guys. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, then you'll definitely enjoy some of the other videos on my channel, so definitely go and check them out. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button down below, because I put a lot of effort into making this video and showing you how to make this Slingbow, so I'd really appreciate it.